And now, a passage from A History of Indiana from its exploration to 1850. The pioneers and their social life. The people. The present population of Indiana, like that of all other American states, is a compound of the civilized nations of Earth. The predominating strain in this population is the English, Scotch, and Irish peasantry. Along the eastern foothills of the Appalachians, these immigrants from Great Britain mingled and fused into a class with pretty well-defined characteristics. They were of the substantial stock of English yeomanry, the stubborn, independent stock that has made the English soldier and the English colonist successful in all parts of the world. The second generation of these folk occupied the high valleys of the mountains from Carlisle and Pittsburgh to the Watauga and Holston. Wherever they settled, they built states and established institutions. The third generation, generally speaking, pushed on across the mountains, establishing boroughs or forts at Limestone, Louisville, Bryant's, Crab Orchard, Boonesboro, and Harrodsburg, many of them pressing on to Vincennes and Kaskaskia. In numerous instances, brothers and sisters parted in the eastern valleys, and their children met as cousins in Kentucky, one branch of the family having come by Tennessee and the Wilderness Road, the other by Pittsburgh and the Ohio River. The fourth generation, about a century after their ancestors came from abroad, crossed the Ohio River into Indiana and Illinois, or crossed the Mississippi River into Missouri and Arkansas. The language of this group of pioneers was the language of the 18th century commoner of England. By calling it a Hoosier dialect, we would claim among the earliest Hoosiers Pope, who made join rhyme with divine, and Burns, who invariably in the full tide of his songs draps the final G in all present active participles. But how, it may be asked, did it happen that a people would get a century behind in their language? A group of people in the heart of a wilderness continent late in the 19th century speaking the language of the early 18th century peasants sounds like an anachronism. The explanation is at hand. When this people settled in the back country of America, they tore themselves away from the culture of England. They separated themselves from the ordinary channels of commercial life and virtually went into exile. The long century struggle with the wilderness and its inhabitants engrossed their whole attention and energy. When they could snatch a moment's rest from the battle, they did pitch their tents and endeavor to reproduce English institutions, but the lure of the wilderness was too strong. The thirst for education was continually upon them. Witness the founding of Washington College at Salem, Tennessee, Transylvania in Kentucky, Vincennes in Indiana, to name only a few. During this whole century, this energetic folk, impressionable, wide awake, free, in a strange country, retained its language almost entirely by memory. The usual library among the pioneers was the Bible, the King James translation. It was a homogeneous group of people, their preachers, their lawyers, their orators, all those who are supposed to influence language were part and kindred of all the rest. There were very few newspapers, and they had a very limited circulation. It is worth noting, however, that there is little trace of dialect in any newspaper. Whether this is due to the typesetters who used a book, or whether it is a case of a written and spoken language existing side by side, does not appear conclusively at present. However, there is abundant evidence that the latter explanation is the proper one. There is no doubt that such eloquent pioneers as Clay, Cass, Lincoln, Cartwright, and Asbury spoke the picturesque native language of their forefathers. The term Hoosier dialect is a misnomer. So far as it can be said to have any justification, it is in connection with the southern element of our population. Whatever peculiarity there may be in it is common to 1/3 of the nation, and a characteristic so common cannot be said to be very singular. The social customs of early Indiana are most clearly understood in the light of their history. Scarcely a feature of their early life but expressed itself earlier in Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia, or the Carolinas, and many customs and conventions were brought from overseas. The charivari, the Christmas shooting, the maltreating of the schoolmaster, the drinking and gambling, the tavern, the shooting match, the election day, the wedding and infare, the log rolling, the quilting, the camp meeting, all smack of the old South and merry England. The open-handed hospitality which regarded it almost an insult for a man to offer to pay for meals or lodging, the quick sense of honor which resented more keenly a reflection on one's integrity than a physical assault, the contempt for business shrewdness or close bargaining, the quick temper, the explosive humor, the wide humanity, the philosophic as opposed to the scientific mind, the deep thought in the homely expression. These are some of the mental characteristics of this people. Thoroughgoing democracy, freedom from all restraint, elbow room, believers in Christianity, though careless of creeds and forms, simplicity in dress and houses, carelessness of accumulated wealth, life above property, neglectfulness of business, enjoyment of plain society and discussion, rarely calling into action their great reserve power on easy terms with the world, believing that the consequences of one's deeds return to the doer, these are some of the leading principles of their philosophy of life. They believed and practiced a community of work, but there was an individual score kept. The man who did not help his neighbor roll logs received no help in return, unless on account of charity. No people were ever more charitable. They borrowed and loaned with the greatest freedom everything from a team and a wagon down to a set of pewter spoons. Yet there was little partnership in the ownership of property. Each family lived to itself and had no great desire to have near neighbors. Home life and customs. The pioneer located his home with little regard to anything but a supply of good water. Southern Indiana was well supplied with springs, and each pioneer home was near one. The style of the house depended on two factors: the time of the settler's arrival and the character of the man. Usually the settler came on ahead of his family, planted his crop, and then proceeded to build a good cabin. If he preferred hunting to work, or took the egg, or if his family came with him, he usually lived a year or two in a half-faced camp. The half-faced camp was a log pen with 3 sides and a covering of brush. Sometimes a large log or a sheltering rock served for a back wall. The front, usually facing the south, was closed by a curtain or hung with skins. In front of this open side the fire was built and the cooking done. The ground was covered with skins and furs. Such a house did very well in dry, warm weather when no real shelter was needed. It was considered a makeshift by the pioneers and only occasionally resorted to. The simpler form of the log house was a 4-sided pen made of rather small round logs, which were notched into each other at the corners so that each log touched the one below. It is said the settlers from the east built their log houses square, while those from the south built theirs about twice as long as wide. The houses were covered with clapboards about 4 feet long, held on by weight poles. A hole for a door was made by cutting out parts of about 4 logs. A wooden board or a skin closed the opening. At the end stood a mud and stick chimney, the framework made of sticks and then covered over with clay. The best form of the log house consisted of 2 pens made of hewed logs. The pens were separated by an entry about 12 feet wide, which served as a porch. A frame window and 2 stone chimneys with 4 fireplaces, 2 downstairs and 2 up, often added an air of luxury to the double log house. The floors were made of heavy puncheons split from ash, walnut, or poplar logs, pinned to the sleepers and dressed smooth with an adze. The taverns were generally of this style. In one corner, on a framework of poles, was the shuck or feather bed, soon replaced by a more comfortable feather bed, pieced quilts, and the famous Carolina coverlets, now highly prized as relics. In the opposite corner of the room was the table with its quaint tableware, part pewter, part gourd, part wooden, and all remarkable for their scarcity. A huge fireplace 6 to 10 feet wide monopolized the opposite end of the house, decorated with a semicircle of 3-legged stools. A trundle bed for the babies was hid away during the daytime under the big bed. The boys scampered up a pole ladder to sleep in the attic. Any number of visitors could be accommodated by spreading the feather bed on the floor. Tradition leaves no doubt that this log cabin hospitality was genuine. There were not many cook stoves in pioneer Indiana. A few might have been found as early as 1820, after which they appeared in increasing numbers. Perhaps 1 family in 5 had a stove by 1840. The immigrant who trudged west on foot or came on horseback even was fortunate if he got through with a skillet and a pot. A spider skillet with lid and an earthen pot were more than the average cooking utensils possessed by a family. The meat was usually cooked on a spit. Cornbread was baked in a small oven, which in reality was a large skillet, if the family was fortunate enough to possess one. If not, then Johnny cakes were baked on a board. If there was no board, the handle was taken out of the hoe and the metal covered with corn dough and cooked. This was the famous hoe cake. Practically all bread was made of meal. All cooking was done over coals drawn out to the front of the fireplace. Sometimes a crane was fixed in the side of the fireplace so that it could be swung on and off the fire at the convenience of the cook. As stated above, cornbread cooked in one of a dozen different ways was the staple food. Next came hominy, and then some kind of meat. In the early days, the most common was venison and bear. Turkey and squirrel were not uncommon. In a few years, chickens and hogs became plentiful. Later, vegetables and fruit appeared on the table, the latter dried for winter use. The cooking was necessarily poor and doubtless accounts for much of the sickness of that early period. The very first pioneers depended almost entirely on skins and furs for their clothing. The hunting shirt, trousers, and moccasins were made of deerskins. A well-made suit with fringed coat, lace leggings, and coonskin cap appeared well, and was fairly comfortable in the warm, dry weather. When wet, it drew up to about one-half its usual dimensions, becoming cold and clammy. Soon, linsey cloth took the place of skins, which, while more comfortable, did not stand the rough wear like buckskin. All hailed with delight the time when they could lay aside both skins and linsey for the home-made woolen garments. A bearskin overcoat, a beaver hat, a pair of buckskin gloves lined with squirrel fur was considered good taste down to the Civil War. Women wore plain dresses with an extra jacket in cold weather. The petticoat was usually of homespun. Woolen shawls were worn instead of coats. Hooks and eyes were used instead of buttons. On their heads, they wore a sunbonnet in summer, a knitted hood in winter. Shoe packs were worn in winter, and all went barefoot, men, women, and children, in summer. Handkerchiefs and gloves were homemade, the former of cotton, the latter of squirrel skins. The children did not wear enough clothes in summer to warrant a description, the maximum being a long shirt hanging straight from the shoulders to the knees. In winter they dressed like their parents, the clothes being made on the same pattern and only slightly smaller. The pioneer boy in his everyday dress was a wonderfully skillful machine, but the same boy dressed for a camp meeting, with starched shirt and brogan shoes, was the most woe-begone creature imaginable. About 1820, imported goods began to appear, such as broadcloths, brocades, taffetas, and peau de soie. Beautiful furs, beaver hats, flounced skirts, balloon-shaped hoops, hats with a garden of flowers, cutaway coats with double-breasted checkered vests, silk stocks over hard buckram collars, such wore the gentlemen and ladies of the old school from 1830 to 1860.